Welcome into the Jazz Notes podcast. I am Ben Anderson, recording this on Monday, February 24th, recording solo. Today, Chandler is out. Expect to have him back next week. But as always, find me on Twitter at Ben's Hoops. Read me at KSLSports.com. You can also find me at Blue Sky, picking up some followers there. So appreciate everybody who, if you have moved over there, is following me as well. It's where you can respond to my prompt, both at Blue Sky and on Twitter, for your mailbag questions that we do to close every Jazz Notes podcast, including today. We got a lot of questions today, so excited to get to those. But I usually send that out about 11 o'clock on Mondays or whatever day we record the show. If it's a holiday, we don't record on Monday. We'll generally record on Tuesday. But I try and send it out an hour before we record the show so everyone can get their most timely questions in. We'll go through our weekly news. We'll get you updated on what happened for the Jazz this last week, what to look forward to this coming week, standings update, and then take a break and get to the mailbag. So let's start with the weekly news. A couple of minor pieces. Quickly, Colin Sexton has retaken the floor, so it sounds like he's doing some stuff in practice. The Jazz sent out a message on Saturday saying he'd be re-examined next week. I don't know if Saturday technically means being re-examined this week means today, or if that means next Monday. But regardless, Colin Sexton nearing a return for the team, so keep an eye on that. The Jazz signed Jaden Springer, which actually is somewhat related to the Colin Sexton injury. Gives you another piece of depth. The Jazz have used him and let him play over his first two games. In fact, he got onto the court before KJ Martin did, the day after he signed his 10-day contract. And I suspect we'll play out his 10-day. Maybe he gets another 10-day. I don't know. We'll talk about that more coming up in the mailbag. We got a question about Jaden, so we'll address that then. But he has seen the floor and has looked okay. And then Bryce Sensabaugh over the All-Star break got engaged. So shout out to Bryce. He's not had the greatest run on the floor, but very cool moment off the floor for the 21-year-old Bryce to get involved. His now fiance has been around quite a bit, and they seem to be close. So obviously, congrats to Bryce. And I know Jazz fans seemed excited about that based on the story we wrote and the engagement we got. So shout out to Bryce Sensabaugh. Here's what happened in Week 17 for the Utah Jazz. Probably further than Week 17, but this is just how we track it. The Jazz fell to the Oklahoma City on Friday. Not a particularly close game. Jazz didn't play all that well. And then had what I thought was maybe their best game of the season against the Houston Rockets on Saturday. The Rockets had beat the Timberwolves the night before. Houston's been in a little bit of a free fall, so they are not, the second best team in the Western Conference like they were through the first half of the year. They've lost a bunch of games. I think they lost 6 or 7 in a row at one point in the last month. So we are starting to see some issues and some cracks form with this Rockets team. And the Jazz took advantage playing them on the second night of a back-to-back, though the Jazz were also playing their second game within 24 hours. But they just looked good. You had Lowry out there, and he played well, and Walker was out there, and he played well, and John Collins was out, and Colin Sexton was out. But you got big performances from Keyonte George, who led the team with 30 points off the bench. He's been playing much better in this new role. You got another double-double from Isaiah Collier. Kyle Filipowski maybe had his most impactful game from a winning standpoint. KJ Martin, I mentioned, was in double figures and looked really good. Lowry Markkanen looked very good, just kind of in a supporting role, which he's done a little bit more of this year than he has in years past. He wasn't, the main focus of the team and what the offense was looking like. That was really kind of picked up by Keyonte off the bench, and he played well. So I thought that was a very nice team win for the Jazz. It's hard to argue. I know Jazz fans don't want to see a lot of these victories rack up. I don't blame you if you're trying to win the lottery, but if it's Keyonte and it's Isaiah and it's Kyle Filipowski and it's 24-year-old KJ Martin, if these guys are helping you win games, I think that's probably okay. If it's John Collins and Colin Sexton and Jordan Clarkson every night that are scoring 25 and you're going to get to 28 wins and have the 8th pick or the 9th pick, I get the frustration there, but I think when you're tied for the second worst record in the Western Conference, and those guys are playing as well as they are, I think that's fine. The young guys going out there and leading the team. So not a bad 2-game series for the Jazz. I think a lot of positives to take from it, and you didn't make up a lot of ground on anybody. Coming up this week, Jazz host Portland tonight. No Lowry Markkanen, no Walker Kessler, so that's going to be a tough game. Kings coming up on Wednesday. Timberwolves on Friday, and then the big game Sunday against the Pelicans. That's going to be the biggest game of the week when it comes to the tanking standings. We'll see where the Pelicans are. The Pelicans and the Jazz are tied at 14 wins with the Charlotte Hornets. Pelicans have one more loss than the Jazz. the Hornets have one fewer losses than the Jazz. So Jazz are technically have the third worst record in the NBA, would have the third best odds of winning the lottery. But as I've said, you always count the wins with these bad teams, and those teams are all tied at 14 wins. And looks like New Orleans playing a little bit better. I know I've said that a few times, but some excitement in the Pelicans organization about Zion Williamson being in shape, being the best shape he's ever been in. Now, he's a hamstring away from missing the rest of the year and that team not winning any games. But when he's on the court, they're dangerous, as they showed erasing a 17-point deficit against the Spurs over the weekend and coming back and winning that game by 20. He's a big-time difference maker when he's on the court, and they probably need to figure out, are they going to keep him long-term? And if so, they probably don't need him to play. But if they're trying to build up his trade value, they probably want to drop him. They probably want to see him get out there and play a whole lot, look good, and then send him out. So you're going to let him look good so you can get a big return for him coming up this offseason. I'm curious how many games we see from Zion the rest of the way, and if he plays Sunday here in Utah, and what might be a skeleton crew for both teams there. All right, mentioned the standings a little bit already. Jazz are at 14 and 42, 14th in the West, 28th overall, half game behind the Pelicans for the worst record in the Western Conference, half game ahead of Charlotte for the fourth worst record in the NBA overall. Charlotte, upcoming schedule, kind of a tough one here, at Kings, at Warriors, at Mavs. I don't expect them to win any of those games, but a good one coming up at the end of the week, just like the Jazz have the Pelicans. They're taking on the Wizards at home. Curious if Charlotte gets that victory or if they fall to the Wizards. I'm not going to put the Wizards schedule on here because, as I mentioned, sitting at 9 wins, 5 back of the Jazz, 5 back of New Orleans, 5 back of Charlotte. I don't see a world where they make those up over the last, 27 games of the season. They're not going to win 5 more games than the Jazz, so I think they're going to wrap up the worst record in the NBA pretty easily, so I don't think we need to worry about them necessarily. But that also applies to the Toronto Raptors of the world and the Philadelphia 76ers and the Brooklyn Nets, who are all at 20 wins. Like the Jazz are technically closer to Washington than they are those teams, so you don't need to worry about either side. Jazz are going to have one of the 4 worst records in the NBA. It's just, are you second or are you fourth? I think that's kind of what you're watching the rest of the way here. And then New Orleans schedule quickly. Home against the Spurs, who they just beat, at Phoenix in back-to-back games. Twice they play the Suns, who are a true disaster and are quickly losing ground in the West, even to make the play-in tournament. And then at the Jazz over the weekend. So that's the big game. Hornets taking on the Wizards at the end of the week. Jazz taking on the Pelicans at the end of the week. We'll have a big role in the tanking standings when we record this again next Monday. All right, let's take a quick break. When we come back, we'll get to your many, many mailbag questions. We'll have a longer segment. Stick around. More Jazz Notes coming up next. Welcome back to the Jazz Notes podcast. I'm Ben Anderson. All right, let's get to the mailbag. As always, find me on Twitter or Blue Sky at Ben's Hoops. I'll send out the prompt. You respond right there on social media, and I will answer your mailbag questions. We'll start with Blue Sky just because there's fewer over there. I have fewer followers, so we get a little less interaction, but get them not out of the way, but address them quickly. Sammy Paradise, who's a frequent replier, says, did Jalen Hood-Schifino get picked up anywhere? Could he sign with the Stars if nobody's interested in him? He seems young to totally give up on. He is hurt. He's still dealing with his hamstring injury, so I don't think he's been picked up anywhere. I talked to some people at the Jazz, kind of got their opinion on him. They would have been happy to keep him around and let him work his way kind of back into health and find a spot on the floor and maybe go down to the Stars and play some games. And I suspect had he gotten healthy before the end of the year, he would have gotten a chance to play on the main roster. But he's just not healthy, and this hamstring injury has kept him out. It happened actually coincidentally against the Jazz in December, and he just has not returned to the floor since, so that stinks for him. So, for his future, he needs to, and it may just behoove him to not play at all this year and still retain some of that youthful mystery of, oh yeah, he's still got all this upside versus, trying to come back too early, re-injuring the hamstring, not getting invited or not being able to play in the summer league, and then not knowing what to do. So, yes, the Jazz could bring him back. He could sign with the Stars. The Jazz could put him on a 10-day. Once Jaden Springer's deal expires, they have options like that. If they wanted to audition him, they could, even though they were the team that waived him. And I had kind of wondered, actually, if that would be the case. But it's fully dependent on being healthy, and he's just not healthy right now. And there's a lot of good players out there. There's a lot of good NBA players or borderline NBA players that are trying to stick that, you don't need to waste a spot if a guy simply can't take the floor. So he has not been picked up, according to my very quick research here. But the Jazz weren't totally out on him as a prospect. Just the numbers crunch kind of made them waive him, and then the injury certainly didn't help either. So we'll keep an eye if he lands somewhere. He could be with the Jazz on their summer league team this offseason. That honestly wouldn't surprise me at all. All right, Jared Crookston, next question. Says, if the kids continue to make the leap like they showed signs of against Houston, how much should that lessen the sting if it means we win enough at the end to reduce our odds of landing Cooper Flag? I understand it's a long shot either way. Yeah, I mean, the hard part would be if 2 years from now, Keyonte's not on the team and Isaiah Collier's not on the team and Kyle Filipowski's not on the team, which the odds of that happening are low. You're going to have at least one of those guys, if not all of them, or at least two of them on the roster most likely, and ideally helping you win the next time you're trying to make a real push to the playoffs. That's what this is about. You don't want to accidentally win 24 games because, these guys got hot, because the problem still is, you're not making the playoffs. There's no value to not putting yourself in the best position to win the lottery at this point. And you've done the hard work where you probably get finished between 2 and 4. They're probably somewhat comfortable with that if it comes down to the last week of the season and they're, within a half game of New Orleans and Charlotte, who we talked about a lot on this podcast. Sit everybody and get the second worst record so you can't fall further than 6. That makes a lot of sense. I think that's valuable, but it's totally okay to win the games with these young players if you're not seriously hurting your lottery odds. So yes, it should lessen the sting. Inevitably, if the Jazz, because they have an 86% chance of not landing the number 1 overall pick, if they end up, at 2, 3, 4, 5, there's going to be people complaining on social media that, they didn't tank hard enough and they could have been Washington, or whoever wins the number 1 overall pick, Jazz should have done that. You can't really play that game, but, the Jazz are trying to thread a very narrow needle with, developing the young players to turn into winners, but not winning enough games. That's hard to do, and I think you're just going to have to live with some of it. And ideally, if, Keyonte's really good down the road, or Isaiah Collier's really good, or Flip's really good, or Cody Williams is really good, who I thought had his best game on Saturday against the Rockets, then you just got to live with it, even if you don't get Cooper Flag, which, again, the team with the 7th best odds might end up moving up and getting them. It might be Portland. It might be Philly. It might be San Antonio. All these teams that are going to be in that conversation. Maybe Chicago jumps up, and it has nothing to do with how many games you actually lost. All right, let's move over to the Twitter side. A bunch of questions coming in. Utah Jazz Optimist. If the Jazz traded Lowry in the offseason, what promising rookie or sophomore player could we get back that could imaginably be their Shai Gilgeous-Alexander? That's always a hard bet. Nobody expected Shai to turn into an MVP, but they were certainly excited about getting young talent at OKC, and one of the reasons they were willing to make this trade, plus all the draft picks. The team I would circle that I could see doing something dramatic or drastic this offseason is the Houston Rockets. The Rockets are a team that, after their hot start and then really slow, second half of the season, if their ownership group decided that they want to make the playoffs next year, and Tillman Fertitta said, gave the GM a demand to get there, I could see them wanting Lowry and thinking that's the piece that's going to put them over the top. And then they have to, match salaries together to get there, and the Jazz aren't just going to give Lowry away, as we learned in this offseason. And you could see something like, Dylan Brooks, just because you got to make salaries match, you got to take some money back. Dylan Brooks, Jabari Smith Jr., and Reed Shepherd, something like that. You're certainly not going to get Amen Thompson. They seem to love him, and rightfully so. He's a very intriguing player. But could you give up, could you get the number 3 pick from last year's team or last year's draft with Jabari Smith, who was a former top 3 pick as well, and, hope that one of those guys was just miscast in their role or just didn't break out like Evan Mobley until their 4th year in the NBA, and then you take advantage of that. I think that's maybe the team I would circle as having some of that potential, but really, it's hard to identify those guys, and if you know who those guys are going to be, you trade everything you can to get them in the first place, and you just don't really have that ability to foresee that. So maybe if the Jazz really like somebody on Houston, I could see them trying to make a move like that. I don't think it's Jalen Green. I think he's probably a little bit past that level where you think he's got this crazy, crazy upside. He's still good. He's a very good player, and maybe you would just take him back in that trade anyways. But I think if you're looking for like high upside young player, Houston is the team I would look at as maybe accidentally giving up a future all-star player for Lauri Markkanen in Jabari Smith or Reed Shepherd or both of them, and you hope one of them really steps up and clicks. And even then, I would bet against Jabari Smith turning into an all-star player at this point in his career. I don't think he's going to get there. And we haven't seen a lot from Reed Shepherd, and what we have seen hasn't necessarily been super promising. But again, he's extremely young. So those are the teams. That's the team I would keep an eye on. All right, next question. Jazz Time Jones. Does Jaden Springer have a shot to stick? He seems capable. Truthfully, probably not. And that's not a knock on Jaden Springer, but I'm just looking at the value of the 10-day contract is a nice piece to just be able to bring guys in. Having that 15th roster spot, just audition 2 or 3 guys. And if you want to let Jaden Springer play for 20 days, great. We can do 2 10-day contracts, and then if you sign up to a third, I think you got to keep him for the rest of the year. But just let him go. No one's going to sign him to this point where it's he locked him up long-term, and you're going to feel like you missed out on something. So I would probably use that as a revolving door. And then if you liked him in the 20 days you spent with him, then bring him back on your summer league team. And if you think he's gotten better at some of the things you told him to work on, and you could see how he would fit, and there's suddenly a spot in the backcourt, then bring him back. But I don't think he projects as a guy right now that's going to stick around long term. I could be totally wrong. They did use their first 10-day on him. Clearly they had their eyes on him and kind of thought that was a player that was worth auditioning, and maybe they like him enough that they keep him around. Luka Šamanić was a 10-day contract who stuck. Chris Dunn was a 10-day contract who stuck. Chris Dunn was good. Luka Šamanić was not. So that's kind of how you have to value those things. And even then they traded Chris Dunn and basically a salary swap for Russell Westbrook and a bad future second-round draft pick. Todd Crow. Isaiah Collier makes the best, most optimal pass almost every single time. Does the brass think he could be a starter going forward? If Jason Kidd played in today's NBA, would he be Russell Westbrook? Yes, I compared the two offensively at least. Jason Kidd's one of the best point guards of all time. Russell Westbrook's in that conversation as well, top 10 point guard of all time. So, I don't think Isaiah Collier is going to get there. Isaiah Collier has a chance to be, one of the best distributors in the NBA of this current era. Trae Young's in that conversation. He leads the league in assists a lot of years. Jokic, I'm going to take out of it just because he's 7 feet tall, so it doesn't really apply to what Isaiah Collier does. So, I wouldn't compare Isaiah to Westbrook or Jason Kidd, certainly. Now, if he learns to shoot, it really changes his outlook, and Russ never did, and Jason Kidd did. And Russ made up for it with all the other things he does and his superb athleticism and fight and fire and competitiveness that were all great. And even then, I think you can question, how much he helped a team win. And Jason Kidd obviously figured out how to win a title with the Dallas Mavericks. So, there's just a lot of value to guys who make the right play. And I don't think you can ever have too many smart players on your team. And Isaiah Collier is a really smart player. And, if he closes games, great. If you were to draft Dylan Harper this summer, who's probably the best point guard on the board, then, maybe Isaiah Collier's not your guy. He's the backup point guard going forward. And then that, throws into some questions of what do you do with Colin Sexton and Keyonte George, but you don't need to cross that bridge until you get there. So, yeah, I'm just, it's so hard to make those types of comparisons for guys. I think the fact that Isaiah Collier seems to have instilled some level of unselfishness on this Jazz roster is a big positive, and I think he can be a good player. Do I think he could start? Sure. I think he could be a starter. He's going to have to hit threes. But he's got reasonable size. He's not so small. He's not, he's much bigger than Mike Conley. He's more comparable, certainly, to Donovan Mitchell, who I always thought was probably better served as a point guard, just based on his size alone with a bigger shooting guard. And it might still be the Cavs' issue this playoffs run as they're trying to do it with Darius Garland. But I think he plays the right position for his size. You're probably going to want to put a bigger 2 guard next to him. And that's where you might want to address it with your next question, Todd. He says, while I'm comparing people, watching VJ Edgecombe, I can't help but think I'm watching a 6'3" Michael Jordan. Yep, compared them to how good would Michael be if he was 6'3" now or in today's game if he was below average volume 3-point shooter. A below average and volume 3-point shooter. Michael obviously would figure it out, would just shoot more threes and would be a great player. Would he be a different player at 6'3" than 6'6"? Yes. Would he not be the greatest player of all time if he was 6'3" instead of 6'6"? Yes. Being those 3 inches really help. It's a huge difference. So, I'm curious to see what VJ Edgecombe's measurements actually are. He's listed at 6'4". Isaiah Collier was listed at 6'5" in college. Isaiah Collier's not close to 6'5". So if VJ Edgecombe's 6'1", that really changes, this toolsy backcourt guard who's not a point guard. he might be too little. And then you might look at a guy like Kasparas Yakashonis going over him at number 4 because he might be a legitimate 6'5", and then you have this big guard who can play both point guard and shooting guard. So I am curious about those guys, but I'm intrigued by VJ. I've watched him a little bit, and super high energy defensive player who is really shooting the three well is intriguing. That's where he and Michael are so much different. That VJ really shoots, and of course comparing him to Michael Jordan is crazy. Speaking of the draft, Dan Compton, if the Jazz had to choose between Dylan Harper, Ace Bailey, or VJ Edgecombe, who would you take in the draft today and why? Again, I don't do super heavy draft stuff. I've watched all of them. Nice thing is with Rutgers, you can watch both Dylan Harper and Ace Bailey together, and then VJ Edgecombe plays in the Big 12, and I cover Utah and BYU on the radio show as well, so I've seen VJ a couple of times. I'll just tell you the positives if you don't know anything about him. Dylan Harper is the best playmaker guard in the draft, like lead ball handler, regularly gets 7, 8, 9 assists, can score 20. He's pretty efficient. He's not knocking down a ton of threes right now at a great rate, but there's not like this major concern, I don't think, that his shot is broken a la Scoot Henderson. Ace Bailey's like 6'10", kind of has a winner mentality. He's a little wild. He's raw, but he's a fantastic shooter. And again, at 6'10", he adds elite size to his front court, and he might not be a front court player. He might be a 2 or a 3 if everything comes along. So curious how he continues to develop there, but his upside is his height and his shooting ability, and his ability to put the ball on the floor. So ideally he can be, more than a Michael Porter Jr. for Denver, who was great. He was a very good piece on a team that won a championship. He might be a bigger, more versatile player than that. And then VJ Edgecombe, who we just talked about, like super toolsy, great defensive, sharp shooting guard, who everyone can get behind and figure out. Not Dwayne Wade necessarily, not that type of player, but a guy who, if the individual playmaking and go-to scoring option develops and gets better as he's stops being 19 years old, as he ages a little bit, he could be, the second best player in this draft. He's in that conversation as well. But I do think that's the order. And you probably just go in order. If you get 2, you take Dylan Harper. If you get 3, you take Ace Bailey. If you get 4, you go with Edgecombe. And if you get 5, you go with Kasparas Yakashonis. So I maybe it'll change. Things usually do change as we get closer to the draft. But kind of seems like right now that's the overall thought. Tiefers says, which of the guys on the end of the bench / two-way guys are on the roster next season? Which of the vets and young guys are not? That's obviously a huge question and hard to figure out, which vets are not back. I would suspect one of John Collins or Colin Sexton is gone, but I've written this a couple of times. Like, it may depend on if you win the lottery. If you get Cooper Flagg and you get to see him in late June, I guess it would be early July, before free agency fully opens, and Cooper Flagg's like a guy like so ready to compete right away that you won't win 19 games with him next year on your roster, regardless of if you have a bunch of veterans or don't have a bunch of veterans. So you're not in the AJ DeBonsa, Cam Boozer conversation anyways. You probably don't need to get rid of everybody. Then again, you've got to make space for him to play. So you might clear out some playing time. But if he looks awesome, you may just want to see what he looks like next to Walker Kessler and Lauri Markkanen and John Collins and Colin Sexton. So as far as the veterans, I think that's really hard to say. Now, if you end up with like the 7th pick and think, okay, can't do this again, you've got to have the worst record in the NBA next year, maybe you do just trade everybody. When you really sink to the bottom and you hope that your 7th pick is good, and then, you get Boozer or DeBonsa or whoever's in this draft next year, and you run with them going forward. But it's hard to say that direction going forward. As far as end of the bench guys, technically I would say KJ Martin's probably an end of the bench guy right now because he's new. He's owed $8 million next year, which is overpriced for what he brings. But, could you waive him because he's on a non-guaranteed deal and bring him back at $4 million? Or do you just keep his expiring contract at $8 million and think that's valuable? I think he's got a chance to stick around. He does some things that make guys around him look good. And when you have Kyle Filipowski, who I think is going to be on the team for a while, who can really pass that way, having somebody who slashes the way he does and cuts back door has a lot of value for a good passing big man, or for a guy like Isaiah Collier and even Keyonte George, who, you've got all these guys now who can catch lobs It's nice to be able to just throw the ball up and leave the defense guessing on if you're shooting or if they're going to be dunking the ball. So I think there's some value there. Josh Chisholm, do you think Keyonte playing better has more to do with going to the bench or playing off the ball? Secondly, has Flip shown anything that makes you think he can play center long-term, or is power forward still going to be his best position? Well, let's answer the second one first. Flip is a pretty good rebounder for his size, which might allow him to play some center. He needs to learn to stop falling down. He falls down every possession. So he's got to get stronger, but he's 21. So I suspect he will get a lot stronger. So I think that's coming. And if he gets stronger, which he should, just because he's in the NBA and grows up and has a great training regimen, he should get big enough to be able to play some center, but I don't think he's ever going to be a full-time center. Probably play some backup five, but probably primarily projects more as a four. With Keyonte playing better, do I think it's the bench or do I think it's off the ball? I think it's a little bit of both. Now, he's playing more on the ball with the second unit, which I think means he's playing against lesser competition, and he's better at it. But also, I think being off the ball is good for him. I think, not having to figure out, when was the last time Lowry Markkanen touched the ball? Does Walker need a lob? Where am I supposed to get to here? Sometimes you just go put him in the corner and let Isaiah hit him in the chest with a perfect pass, and he just goes right up for the shot. And then he finds his rhythm, and then he's in rhythm the rest of the game. I think that's beneficial for him versus, what was the game plan? What was I asked to do? I'm also guarding the opposing team's best backcourt player, which you look around the NBA right now, and every matchup is really hard, especially if you're in the backcourt and you're a starter. Every opposing team has a great guard. If you look down the Western Conference, on a given week, you might defend any one of Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, Ja Morant, Jamal Murray, Luka, Jalen Green, James Harden, Anthony Edwards, Kyrie Irving, Steph Curry, De'Aaron Fox, Devin Booker. There's no bad guards. There's not bad guards in the NBA if you're starting. So that's a really tough job. So if he doesn't have to do that, I think that's helped him be a more effective player. And I've been impressed with him off the bench. And really, you can't always cherry pick their worst game out, but sometimes if it's the first game after they make a switch, I think it's interesting to, drop that, just like the first game of a season. It's always a little hairy, or the first game after a trade is always a little bit hairy. If you take Keyonte George's first game off the bench out of the picture, because he was 3 of 15 and 0 of 8 from the three-point line, he was bad because he really hadn't been in that spot, and I think it probably wounded his pride a little bit. He's playing pretty well. He's over 40% from the floor. He's at 35% from three. He's right up at 16 points per game still. He's over 6 assists a game, which would lead all players coming off the bench. So he's done a really nice job. I've been impressed with his rebounding, which has really climbed since he moved to the second unit. I think he's seen some of how Isaiah Collier's affected the game and is mimicking that and having success. So it's not all positive, but I think it's getting better, and I think you're seeing a potential role for him going forward where he has the ball as the backup, which gives him easier opponents, but he can also play with Isaiah Collier at times in different stretches and has a more simplified life because he doesn't have to make all these decisions. Oh, by the way, let me update this really quick for you. 13 games since moving to the bench, excluding his first game, which seemed to rattle him. He's averaging 18 points and 6.3 assists. I mean, any sophomore averaging 18 points and 6 assists would be really exciting, whether they're starting or coming off the bench. And then you mix in the Keyonte shooting 46% from the floor, 37% from three, and is averaging 4.4 rebounds, like I mentioned. That's awesome. Those are awesome numbers. And he's got to, impact winning. He's got to have the Jazz can't be a negative every time he's on the court. And by the way, they haven't been. He's having more and more games where he's got a positive plus minus. So he's affecting change in a good way. So it was a good adjustment from Will Hardy, whether it was just a message to Keyonte or just, hey, this is probably who you are as an NBA player and there's value in that. We will see, but it's been effective. So, it's probably both of those things, Josh. Riley O'Brien, if the Jazz miss out on Cooper Flagg, would getting Dylan Harper be the best possible consolation prize? Is Harper a better prospect than, say, Scoot Henderson, who was lauded as a can't-miss point guard prospect? It seems right now like Dylan Harper's the guy. Again, I think teams are going to be really impressed when they see Ace Bailey come into their gym, work out 1-on-0, knock down 80 out of 100 threes or whatever it is, 70 out of 100 threes and be 6'10". It's just that's really impressive. And it's not the wrong answer. Size is a huge difference maker in the NBA. And if you're that big and you shoot really well and you still have upside, I can see a lot of scenarios where a team prefers that over the more NBA-ready Dylan Harper because, as I just mentioned, there's good guards everywhere. The Jazz have good guards, If you think a night off is you get to go up against Isaiah Collier, Keyonte George, Colin Sexton, and Jordan Clarkson, you're crazy. But it may not be as difficult as going up, or it may be less difficult than going up against, Luka Doncic. So I get that part of it. So maybe the Jazz would just say, hey, the backcourt's deep. You want a front court player. 6'10" guys don't come around very often. You like the idea of Ace Bailey and Cody Williams and Taylor Hendricks and Lauri Markkanen and Walker Kessler just being huge in the front court. I get that. I would totally buy it. So while I think teams will lean towards Dylan Harper, no, I don't think anything is fully set there. But, I need to watch him more. I need to see how big the gap is between those guys. Tiefers, what do you think Minnesota's record is to end the season? Odds their pick is in the lottery. So with Victor Wembanyama getting hurt, the Spurs are out of the picture to make a run, and they really were out of it anyways. But, the outside chance that they were going to get good enough to make a run at the Western Conference playoffs is out of the picture now. They're 3.5 games back of Sacramento. I don't think they're going to get better. I think they're going to start to go into tank mode towards the end of the year. And then Phoenix is just a disaster. I mean, Phoenix is 2-8 in their last 10 games, and they're healthy. It's crazy what's going on with the Suns right now. One of the most disappointing seasons in NBA history. And it's the only reason they're not getting more heat right now is because Philly's actually been worse this season because Philly only has 20 wins on the year. So I think the top 10 are pretty set. In what order, I don't know. The best situation for the Jazz is that the Timberwolves find themselves in the play-in and then, Dallas in the 7-8 matchup. I mean, best case scenario would be the Timberwolves, fall to 9, which is not impossible. Let me update you on the standings before we get too far. Clippers right now sit in the 6th seed at 15 games back of number 1 overall. Minnesota is in the 7th seed, so they are in the play-in tournament currently 16 games back overall. So they're 1 game back of the guaranteed spot in the playoffs. The Dallas Mavericks are tied with the Minnesota. They've got the identical 31-27 record. Golden State is a half game behind them for the 9th seed. And then the Sacramento Kings are in the 10th seed. They are 18 games back, so they're 2 games back of both Dallas and Minnesota. And let me remind you, because I think sometimes we forget this, the 7th seed plays the 8th seed, and the 9th seed plays the 10th seed. Whoever wins between 7 and 8 in the play-in tournament automatically goes to the playoffs. Whoever wins the 9-10 matchup then plays the number 8 matchup. So, I mean, best case scenario is that Minnesota falls to 9 or 10 and then loses their first round play-in tournament matchup and gets eliminated from the playoffs. That's best case scenario. Next best case scenario is, they're 9 or 10, they win, and then they lose to whoever finishes, 7th or 8th and loses that 7-8 game. And then the third, I guess, would be, they finish 8th, they go on the road for their first play-in tournament game, lose that one, have to play the winner of 9-10, and then lose that game. So there are scenarios where they finish in the top 10 where I think they're pretty much guaranteed to to land at the end of the year, but still miss the playoffs. You just want them between 7 and 10 and then to lose in the play-in tournament twice or once if they fall to 9 or 10. So do I think it's going to happen? No. I think they're going to gel, but, they are susceptible like anybody is. If they were to get an injury like Dallas has right now where their entire front court is out, Minnesota probably can't sustain losing either Naz Reid or Rudy Gobert for an extended period of time. They don't have good depth in their front court. If Ant were to go down, they'd be in huge trouble. They probably can't survive that. So that's what you've got to keep an eye on for them going forward. Julius Randle's been out. They've been okay. They're 4-6 in their last 10. They're up. They're better than that. So when Julius Randle comes back, I think it will actually help them. But Dallas at some point should get healthy. Golden State's probably the best team in this group after adding Jimmy Butler. They're playing great since the trade deadline. And we'll see if Sacramento figures it out after acquiring Zach LaVine. Maybe they get better as they get a little bit more time under their belts to gel. So that's what I'm keeping an eye on. Minnesota doesn't have a whole lot to look forward to as far as getting better, unless you think Julius Randle's going to, change his stripes and suddenly be a different player. And then you just hope the Clippers keep winning games. They're 5-5 in their last 10. You hope they keep winning and keep Minnesota on the outside of the guaranteed playoff spot. All right, last question. I know this has been a long mailbag. I appreciate everyone sticking with me. You can hear me. I'm losing my voice. Trevor Webb, if we actually slip to 6 or 7, who do we draft? Do we really just settle for Trey Johnson or Liam McNeely, or would you package some future assets to try and move up to the top 5 with how dire early this draft is in our rebuild? Con Kneppel from Duke's also in this conversation at 6 or 7 or whatever. But you have the assets to move up. That's the nice thing. Yeah, if you wanted to get up to 4 and maybe even 3, if there are teams that are, so rattled by Ace Bailey defensively or his assist numbers or whatever that they don't want to acquire him, or he's too repetitive of what they're doing, or they're low on draft capital. The nice thing about that unprotected future Phoenix Suns pick that you have has a lot of value. Maybe you could send that and 7 or 8, 7, and that pick to move up to 4 and get a VJ Edgecombe or an Ace Bailey if he were to slip. I think that's possible. The Jazz certainly have the draft capital to move from 7 to 4, I think, if they wanted to do it. Can you get into the top 3? I don't know how solidified that top 3 is, and if it's impenetrable like it was in the Victor Wembanyama draft. That's always the big question. So we'll have to get closer. We'll have to see what teams land where, if they need more draft picks or if they want young players or if somebody finishes the season really strong for the Jazz and that guy has a lot of value, you could help there. If a team that wants to win next year ends up with the number 3 overall pick, weirdly, like Philly, and says, oh man, we'd really like Lowry Markkanen, we'll give you the number 3 pick for Lowry and, your 7th pick, then those things open up. So I think some of those questions I wish I had more or better answers for, but there's just so many moving pieces involved with it. All right, that'll do it for today's podcast. Again, I appreciate everyone sticking with me. I know my voice is off a little bit today. We'll have Chandler back with us next week and get back to your regular programming. Follow me on Twitter at Ben's Hoops. Find me on Twitter or at Blue Sky at Ben's Hoops. Read me at CancelSports.com. We'll be back with you next week.